York City, the epicenter of the pandemic, this is Democracy Now!
We now must put our differences aside and cooperate and listen to the science and the experts, as in every emergency. Humanity has to stand together in solidarity and leave no one behind. And then when this is finally over, we must start building real sustainable societies within the planetary boundaries.
That was Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg. Yes, today marks the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, when more than 20 million Americans joined in actions to protect the environment, 10% of the U.S. population at the time. Half a century later, in the middle of the pandemic, protests planned around the world have moved online. And the Trump administration has gutted the Environmental Protection Agency, established not long after Earth Day, rolled back fuel economy standards, and eased the enforcement of pollution regulations. We'll talk with author and 350.org founder Bill McKibben about how we can build a hardier world after the coronavirus and why he's demanding on this Earth Day, stop the money pipeline.
The fossil fuel industry requires the massive influx of constant funding from the big banks, from the big insurance companies, and the big asset managers. That's literally, that money is the oxygen on which global warming burns.
We'll also go to Chile to speak with Angela Valenzuela, youth activist and former coordinator with Fridays for Future Chile. Then to Africa, where some 265 million people who are expected to face acute hunger as the coronavirus crisis could trigger a second pandemic of hunger.
If this coronavirus did not kill people with disability, definitely this hunger of stay at home will kill people. Because let me tell you, most of my people, they don't eat.
We'll speak with South African activist Kumi Naidoo, former Secretary General of Amnesty International and former head of Greenpeace. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Coronavirus infections continue to climb worldwide, officially at 2.5 million confirmed cases and 178,000 deaths linked to COVID-19, though the true toll is certain to be far, far higher. A top United Nations official warned Tuesday governments must act immediately to prevent a second pandemic of hunger from economic freefall unleashed by the virus. David Beasley, executive director of the World Food Program, told the UN Security Council Tuesday the number of hungry people worldwide could soon double to 265 million unless urgent steps are taken.
There are no famines yet, but I must warn you that if we don't prepare and act now to secure access, avoid funding shortfalls, and disruptions to trade, we could be facing multiple famines of biblical proportions within a short few months.
The UN Security Council was meeting virtually online. In the United States, the epicenter of the pandemic, the death toll from COVID-19 has topped 45,000. On Tuesday, the U.S. Senate approved $484 billion in new coronavirus aid on a voice vote, with many senators remaining at home due to the pandemic. The bill adds another $310 billion to the Paycheck Protection Program, providing loans to small businesses, another $75 billion for hospitals, $25 billion for testing, and $60 billion for emergency disaster loans and grants. The House is expected to vote on the legislation today. The bill provides no new stimulus checks for U.S. households, no additional money for food stamps, no limits on fossil fuel bailouts, no funds for election security, no bailout for the U.S. Postal Service, and no additional funds for hard-hit state and local governments. Democratic Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez told MSNBC Tuesday lawmakers are failing to provide for millions of unemployed people who are unable to pay rent and increasingly at risk of going hungry.
We are abdicating our responsibility. We haven't legislated for a month, and thousands of people are dying. Thousands of people are dying every day. And we aren't going, and we're talking about coming back, and every time we pass one of these bills, we're hearing that the real solution is coming in the next bill, and then the next bill, and the next bill. And at some point, we have to raise our hands and say, when is the solution coming? Because 2 months of rent are going to pass by before we're actually even entertaining a real bill.
The House and Senate have extended their recesses another 2 weeks until May 4th. Progressive lawmakers are demanding $2,000 monthly payments to U.S. households and open enrollment in Medicare for uninsured and unemployed people when lawmakers take up another round of funding, the so-called Phase 4 coronavirus bill. The Trump Organization is seeking rent relief for the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C., which is housed in a federally owned building leased by the Trump administration. The watchdog group Common Cause tweeted in response, quote, "This is what we call a conflict of interest," also known as corruption or unconstitutional emoluments violations, they said. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo traveled to Washington, D.C. Tuesday for talks with President Trump at the White House, where the pair reportedly agreed to ramp up diagnostic testing for COVID-19 in New York. Nearly 15,000 New Yorkers have died of the disease, with more than 250,000 testing positive, though the true infection rate is certain to be far higher due to a critical shortage of testing capacity. Meanwhile, scores of immigrant rights activists drove their cars through a largely empty Times Square in Manhattan Tuesday, blaring their horns in a protest demanding emergency cash benefits for undocumented workers. Governor Cuomo has so far refused to follow California's example by aiding immigrants who did not qualify for the federal government's $1,200 coronavirus relief payments. In Wisconsin, health officials in Milwaukee report at least 7 people contracted the coronavirus at polling places during the controversial primary elections on April 7th. State officials worry that number could climb as more data about Election Day-related infections becomes available. In-person voting proceeded after the conservative majority on the Wisconsin State Supreme Court overturned an order by Governor Tony Evers to delay in-person voting until early June. In South Dakota, a second worker at a massive Smithfield pork processing plant has died of COVID-19. At least 760 coronavirus cases are linked to the plant, which shut down indefinitely last week as cases exploded. In Iowa, local officials are urging Governor Kim Reynolds to shut down the Tyson Foods pork processing plant in Waterloo, as at least 90% of coronavirus cases in Black Hawk County are traced back to the Tyson plant workers. In Raleigh, North Carolina, an estimated 1,000 people flouted social distancing guidelines Tuesday to hold a protest at the state capitol demanding a lifting of remain-at-home orders. Protesters waved anti-vaccination signs and called for the firing of top U.S. infectious disease expert Dr. Anthony Fauci. Hundreds more gathered in Jefferson City, Missouri, for a similar protest. Recent anti-quarantine protests were organized by Freedom Works and Tea Party patriots backed by Koch Industries, as well as the far-right group Minnesota Gun Rights and a conservative network linked to the family of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. On Tuesday, Attorney General William Barr said the Justice Department may take legal action against governors who continue to order residents to remain at home during the pandemic. Outside the White House, dozens of nurses held a protest and vigil Tuesday, reading the names of 50 healthcare workers who've died after becoming infected by the coronavirus on the job.
Larice Anderson, New Orleans, Louisiana. Davina Akkad, Detroit, Michigan. John Abruzzo, Long Island, New York.
The protest was organized by National Nurses United, which is demanding the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, require adequate personal protective equipment for healthcare workers.
I would help anyone until I couldn't, but I can't help anyone if I'm dead or sick.
Last week, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported 9,200 healthcare workers have tested positive for COVID-19, though the CDC admits the true rate is likely much higher. In California, Santa Clara County's medical examiner Tuesday said 2 people died of COVID-19 on February 6th and 17th, weeks before Washington State reported the first U.S. fatality from the disease on February 28th. The finding adds to evidence the coronavirus was circulating in the United States much earlier than previously thought. A new study funded by the National Institutes of Health has found coronavirus patients administered the drugs hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin had a higher death rate than those receiving standard care alone. On Tuesday, a panel of experts at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases recommended against the use of the drugs, saying they increase the risk of sudden cardiac death in patients. President Trump has repeatedly touted the drugs as a miracle cure for COVID-19. In March, he tweeted, quote, "They have a real chance to be one of the biggest game changers in the history of medicine," he tweeted. Meanwhile, Robert Redfield, the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, warned Tuesday that a second wave of coronavirus infections may sweep the United States next winter, which could be even deadlier than the first wave, since it would coincide with the flu season. Hundreds of workers called in sick Tuesday at Amazon warehouses around the United States demanding paid time off work while improved safety measures are implemented. This is Jordan Flowers, a worker at Amazon's West JFK 8 warehouse in Staten Island, New York.
We have over 50-plus COVID cases inside our warehouse. We are putting our lives at risk, our communities at risk, our families at risk, and most important, our customers at risk. We need Jeff Bezos to close down these warehouses and have us on 2 weeks paid leave with retro pay for UPT. We need our Governor Cuomo to clean up Amazon. I am home on strike, not planning to return to work no time soon.
President Trump said Tuesday he'll issue an executive order suspending permanent residency applications or green cards for the next 60 days.
Closing immigration will help put unemployed Americans first in line for jobs as America reopens. So important. It would be wrong and unjust for Americans laid off by the virus to be replaced with new immigrant labor flown in from abroad.
As President Trump, however, will not suspend visas for temporary farm workers who are essential to the country's food supply. In Texas, 24 asylum seekers at the for-profit Prairieland Detention Center near Dallas have tested positive for COVID-19. In Arizona, asylum seekers jailed at the La Palma Correctional Center near Phoenix are receiving waivers from CoreCivic, freeing the for-profit prison company from liability if immigrant prisoners contract COVID-19. In exchange, CoreCivic will provide prisoners with a single face mask to use indefinitely. The forms written in Spanish read in part, quote, "I understand and accept that I must complete and sign this form in order to use a face mask at CoreCivic facilities," unquote. In Michigan, 60-year-old prisoner William Garrison died of COVID-19 April 13th, just days before he was set to be released on parole because his age made him vulnerable to the coronavirus. Garrison had served 44 years in prison after he was convicted of murder as a 16-year-old. In Ohio, more than 1,800 prisoners and over 100 prison staff have tested positive for COVID-19 at the Marion Correctional Institution. The prison is now the nation's leading coronavirus hotspot. In Arkansas, Governor Asa Hutchinson announced Tuesday that nearly 40% of the state's coronavirus cases are concentrated at the Cummins Maximum Security Prison, where some 850 prisoners have tested positive. In southern Greece, 148 asylum seekers have tested positive for COVID-19 at a hotel converted into a quarantine center for migrants. Most of those infected are single parents from the Democratic Republic of Congo and Cameroon. This follows 2 other coronavirus outbreaks at crowded migrant camps near Athens. Mexican officials say the country has entered its most severe stage in the spread of the coronavirus, what they refer to as Phase 3. Meanwhile, hundreds of factory workers in Ciudad Juarez protested Monday, demanding a closure of maquiladora assembly plants along the U.S.-Mexico border, where at least 4 workers in U.S.-owned factories have died of COVID-19.
They say we are under quarantine and we should be in our homes, but this company is now closed because this company is essential. As if people are desperate to buy refrigerators, stoves, or washing machines. As if they're very important. Of course they aren't. Now, the most important thing is to be safe at home. We have children, and we are risking our children's health by coming to work.
Also in Mexico, Chihuahua state officials say COVID-19 deaths have increased nearly sixfold within 10 days in Ciudad Juarez. At least 13 of those deaths were of employees working at U.S.-run maquiladoras. Meanwhile, the Pentagon's urging Mexico to reopen factories that were shuttered amidst the pandemic, as many U.S. weapons manufacturers rely on Mexican labor. Back in the United States, President Trump promised Tuesday to bail out U.S. fossil fuel producers after an unprecedented collapse in oil markets pushed benchmark crude prices into negative territory, meaning some traders were paying customers to offload oil. On Tuesday, Trump tweeted, "We'll never let the great U.S. oil and gas industry down. I've instructed the Secretary of Energy and Secretary of the Treasury to formulate a plan which will make funds available so that these very important companies and jobs will be secured long into the future," Trump tweeted. In response, journalist and activist Naomi Klein wrote, quote, "Democrats need to counter with a sweeping plan to cover the full salaries of fossil fuel workers while they train for the clean economy. Time to wind down this abusive industry that's always relied on massive public subsidies," she tweeted. This week, Oxford University passed a resolution requiring its endowment fund to divest from fossil fuel companies. At Harvard, President Larry Bacow said Tuesday his university would move its $41 billion endowment to carbon-neutral investments by 2050. The student group Divest Harvard called the move insufficient, writing in a statement, quote, "By evading divestment, Harvard is once again standing with fossil fuel companies and against its students' futures," unquote. After headlines, we'll speak with environmentalist Bill McKibben, founder of 350.org, former Greenpeace director Kumi Naidoo on this, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And Iran said Wednesday it's launched its first military satellite into orbit after a series of launch attempts last year ended in failure. Iran has long accused the United States of a covert program of sabotage targeting its aerospace supply chain. And last year, President Trump seemed to confirm the program in a tweet taunting Iran following a mysterious explosion at a rocket launch site. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. With Juan Gonzalez, we're broadcasting from the center of the pandemic in New York City. Juan is in New Jersey, the #2 state for this pandemic. Hi, Juan.
Good day, Amy, and good day to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, today marks the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, started half a century ago by Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson as a national teach-in on the environment. In 1970, more than 20 million Americans participated in that first Earth Day from coast to coast, 10% of the U.S. population at the time. Later that year, Congress established the Environmental Protection Agency and passed landmark laws to protect air and water quality, marine mammals, and endangered species. Earth Day looks quite different a half-century later in the midst of the pandemic as events and protests planned around the world have moved online. It comes as the Trump administration's gutted fuel economy standards and eased the enforcement of pollution regulations, and the Environmental Protection Agency has implemented its secret science rule that limits the use of studies that don't make their underlying data public. This year's Earth Day also comes in an election year. More than 50 scientists, including prominent climate experts, released a letter this week endorsing former Vice President Joe Biden for president, writing, quote, "We are confident that, unlike President Trump, Joe Biden will respect, collaborate with, and listen to leaders in the scientific community and public health experts to confront the existential climate crisis and other environmental threats," unquote. Last week, Senator Bernie Sanders endorsed Biden with an announcement of plans to form a joint policy task force on climate, and Biden said expanding his climate platform is a, quote, key objective. This comes as Trump promised Tuesday to bail out U.S. fossil fuel producers after an unprecedented collapse in oil markets. Meanwhile, Oxford University has just passed a resolution requiring its endowment fund to divest from fossil fuel companies. And Harvard's president said Tuesday his university would divest from plans to decarbonize its endowment by 2050, which the student group Divest Harvard condemns, saying Harvard's once again standing with fossil fuel companies and against its students' futures. To talk about how far we've come since the first Earth Day 50 years ago and the challenges ahead, we're joined by Bill McKibben from his home in Vermont, author, educator, environmentalist, co-founder of 350.org. In his recent piece for The Nation, he writes, "This Earth Day, Stop the Money Pipeline." His piece in the New Yorker magazine asks how we can build a hardier world after the coronavirus. His latest book, Falter, has the human game begun to play itself out. Bill, thanks so much for rejoining us on Democracy Now! Can you talk about the significance of this 50th anniversary of Earth Day and where we stand half a century after that, April 22nd, 1970?
Absolutely. Amy and Helen, both for keeping us during these weird times. Look, 50 years ago was probably the single biggest day of political action in American history. 2% of the population. It was an uprising. It was an uprising.
Bill, we're having trouble with your line. We're going to reconnect with you, and we're going to take a break while we do that. Bill McKibben is author, educator, environmentalist, co-founder of 350.org. After we speak to Bill in Vermont, we're going to London to speak with Kumi Naidoo. He is the first African to head Greenpeace. He's the former head of Greenpeace and the former head of Amnesty International. And then we're heading to Chile. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with them in a moment. That's Mother Earth, a tribute to Earth, released by the Earth Day Network India to commemorate Earth Day's 50th anniversary. Their theme for Earth Day 2020 is climate action. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. As we mark this 50th anniversary of Earth Day, started half a century ago, 10% of the U.S. population participated in events. We are joined by Bill McKibben, who is the founder of 350.org, author, educator, environmentalist. His latest book, Falter, Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out? His recent piece in the New Yorker, How We Can Build a Hardier World After the Coronavirus. And in The Nation, he wrote a piece, This Earth Day, Stop the Money County pipeline. Bill, we're going to try this again from your home in Vermont. Hope we have a better connection. Talk about the significance of this Earth Day 50 years later and what needs to happen now in the midst of this pandemic.
Sure. And thanks for bearing with me in the midst of all the rearrangements we're all making in our lives. Look, 50 years ago, as you say, was probably the biggest day of political action in American history. And it came out of the fury over the dirty air and the dirty water that marked our country. People were wearing surgical masks 50 years ago today, too, but they were doing it to protest the almost unbreathable air in many of our cities. The kind of air we now see in places like Beijing and Delhi. Those early warriors we owe a great debt of thanks to because they changed the zeitgeist. And in the wake of that massive show of protest, President Nixon, conservative Republican, signed the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, everything else, all the acts that Donald Trump is systematically trying to gut. That was a remarkable accomplishment, and our air and water are cleaner. But we didn't make the kind of systemic fundamental changes that we would have needed to head off the much deeper environmental perils that face us now. I mean, in the last 50 years, Amy, the temperature has obviously gone sharply up. We've lost half the sea ice in the summer Arctic. The chemistry of the oceans has changed and changed dramatically. We've lost some of the biggest living things on Earth, the Great Barrier Reef, large parts of our rainforests. Half the wild animals in the world are dead now compared to 40 years ago. Those are remarkable changes that need to be met with remarkable upsurge again in protest and action. And we're seeing some of that, and we're seeing some of it today, albeit online at this 72 hours of Earth Day on live that begins at 9 o'clock on Earth Day morning. It's a struggle, a deeper struggle than we've ever seen before. And the salience of that struggle is highlighted as we deal with the pandemic. What are the messages that come out of this strange moment in human history? One, that reality is real, that you can't hector or fight with or force to negotiate or compromise chemistry or physics or biology. Both the COVID microbe and the carbon dioxide molecule are immune to political persuasion, no matter how much our president yells at them. If they say, stand 6 feet apart, we stand 6 feet apart. If they say it's time to stop burning coal and gas and oil, then that's what we need to do. Similarly, we're learning lessons about delay and timing here that are crucial. As you know, the countries that flattened the coronavirus curve early on are doing far better than those like ours, which delayed. That's a pretty perfect analog to the 30 years that we've wasted in the climate crisis. And I think third, maybe most powerfully, the lesson that we're learning is social solidarity is almost everything. You know, Amy, this era in our political life began, in a sense, with Ronald Reagan announcing that the 9 scariest words in the English language were, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. But those aren't the scariest words in the English language. The scariest words are, we've run out of ventilators. The hillside behind your house is caught on fire. And those kind of things we can only face together. So maybe we're seeing the beginning of the end of this doctrine of every man for himself as we come through this linked and escalating series of crises.
Bill, I wanted to ask you, given the, ironically, this pandemic has led to a situation where the air on Earth is probably cleaner, as I think you've remarked, than at any time in recent memory as a result of so many planes being grounded, so many cars unable to the passengers get into them, and so much of industry ground to a halt. I'm wondering your thoughts about how the pandemic is going to affect the battle over climate change in the future.
Well, so there are people on Earth, one, who are getting literally their first lungfuls of clean air this month in their lives. And as we worry about the damage, and we must, that comes with coronavirus, we should think also of all the other things that go after our lungs. We have 5 million children in Delhi damage just from breathing the air. So there's definitely there's definitely a kind of change that even as we all live through the horror of this pandemic, there are people who are glimpsing the way that the world could be. If we all go straight to normal, it won't mean very much fun.
Bill, we're going to try to fix this feed a little better, but I do want to read what Trump tweeted again. We said it earlier. He said, "We will never let the great U.S. oil and gas industry down. I have instructed the Secretary of Energy and the Secretary of the Treasury to formulate a plan which will make funds available so that these very important companies and jobs will be secured long into the future." Can you, Bill McKibben, respond to what he is saying right now in the midst of this pandemic?
So the great oil and gas industry has been subsidized for 100 years with trillions of dollars in taxpayer money. And now there's no demand for its product. And it's being wind. So the oil industry is in huge trouble. We saw great news yesterday when Oxford University, most famous university on earth, divested from fossil fuel on the theory that you could never, that it's both immoral and uneconomical. More good news this morning when American University did the same thing here in the States. These are powerful signs. And yes, all they've got left is kind of political juice, and Trump will do everything he can to try and bail them out with our money. But we've got to try and make sure that that doesn't happen, that workers get protected, that we have a just transition for people who, through no fault of their own, are employed in that industry. But it's folly of the highest order to continue subsidizing an industry that, A, is wrecking the planet, and B, no longer makes any economic sense.
Bill, I wanted to ask you about your emphasis of late on cutting off the money spigot for the fossil fuel industry. There's the announcement recently of Citigroup that they are going to, the third largest bank in the United States, that they're going to, from now on, not invest in new coal-fired power plants or oil and gas exploration in the Arctic Circle. Is this movement beginning to have a real impact on the financial underpinnings of the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, Juan, it sure is. One of the sadnesses about the pandemic from an organizer point of view is that this movement was cresting, and there would have been today people doing nonviolent civil disobedience sit-ins in probably half the 5,000 Chase Bank branches around America. Some of us were arrested at the first of these in January in an effort to kind of launch this thing. We can't do that, obviously, so people are going online. This Earth Day Live thing is going to be really spectacular. But the finance arm of the climate fight really has been growing fast in the last year. Probably the biggest victory was getting BlackRock to make a series of announcements. This is the biggest asset manager on Earth, really the biggest box of money on the planet, getting them to make a series of announcements about their new climate policies. Now we're monitoring to see if they're serious about it, to see if they're actually doing it. One of the first tests will come next month when Chase Bank, biggest bank in the world, tries to reappoint 81-year-old Lee Raymond to the lead post of lead independent director. He's the guy who ran Exxon for 15 years in the years when it was pioneering corporate climate denial. And now he runs the board of the biggest fossil fuel funder on Earth. That's the kind of thing that needs to stop, and we'll see. I mean, this pressure is going to be as unrelenting as we can make it, even amidst a pandemic.
And New York City Council, what will it be voting on, Bill McKibben? You just had a virtual news conference with City Council members.
Yes, Brad Lander and other City Council members announced Monday that they were seeking to help cut ties between the city and banks like Chase that don't take climate change seriously. And that's a big deal because cities do a lot of business with these guys. Remember, Amy, that one difference between, we've pressured the fossil fuel companies very hard and to great effect. The divestment campaign's the biggest anti-corporate campaign in history now. With $14 trillion engaged. But the fossil fuel industry will fight to the last bridge. They only know how to do one thing. If you're a bank like Chase, you lend a lot of money, $250 billion in the last 4 years to the fossil fuel industry, but it's still only 6 or 7% of your business. So you might change and change fast if you got sufficient pressure, and that's the pressure that people are building now.
And the live stream of the 3 days of celebrations, Bill McKibben, in the midst of this pandemic, where can people go? And your final comment on what this pandemic can mean. Arundhati Roy talks about the pandemic as a portal and how in the midst of this terrible suffering, something can come out that makes this world better and safer for everyone.
Well, Google Earth Day Live to join this live stream, and then take a moment to reflect about the beauty that remains yet on even this hard-pressed world. It is our job, the job of our time on Earth, to try and figure out how to slow down and limit the civilization-threatening changes that we see going on around us. We're capable of doing it. The engineers have provided us with the gift in the form of sun and wind energy. Let's see if we can come together to take advantage of it. We better, if we're on the current trends, then 50 years from now, Earth Day won't be a celebration. It will be a funeral.
Bill McKibben, we thank you for being with us, author, educator, environmentalist, co-founder of 350.org. We'll link to your pieces in the New Yorker magazine as well as The Nation. In it, he writes, "This Earth Day stopped the money pipeline." When we come back, Kumi Naidu, the former head of Greenpeace and Amnesty International. Stay with us.
Metina aduna amna Sénégal duguna ci gox yi amna ñi mu dal nañu moytu salte setal question de santé nationale babul ba jëfé ko message bi dafa clair wel ñoo ngi ñaan corona dem terre waruñu xaajal dañ bolo mën ko guerre dimbal ak yërmande ci dëkkandoo yi frère ar sa bopp ar ñi la jege tamit ku nekk def sa wàllu ñu daan ko amul salit sa xët tek ci sa loxo waroo génne tuflit sa xët ci mouchoir so pare yóbbu mbalit mbasa yaram tangul bat bopp cër di tim ngay wopp xëy di liw ba di xonk rongoñ di rogalaat sa kët di xiixat jafe-jafe nooyi set daal ci gàttal dalay musal ci coronavirus.
Shield Against Coronavirus by Senegal hip-hop collective Yanamari. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. 265 million. That's the number of people expected to face acute hunger as the coronavirus crisis could trigger a pandemic of hunger. This according to a new United Nations report. The study released Tuesday says the number of severely hungry people worldwide will nearly double by the end of this year due to the impact of the spread of COVID-19. On Tuesday, the head of the World Food Program warned the world will see multiple famines of biblical proportions if swift action isn't taken. The crisis is projected to disproportionately affect Africa, where there's already widespread hunger. In South Sudan, a food crisis affected more than 60% of the population last year. Now, with the coronavirus, reports of growing desperation are laying bare rampant inequality across the continent. In South Africa, Africa, which is under strict lockdown. As the African nation with the most reported COVID-19 cases, there's reportedly a food crisis in Cape Town, as the ongoing lockdown has left informal workers who've lost their livelihoods with little relief. There are also reports of growing panic about hunger in Nigeria. This is a resident of Lagos, Nigeria's largest city.
If this coronavirus did not kill people with disability, definitely this hunger of stay at home will kill people. Because let me tell you, most of my people, they don't eat.
This comes as the World Health Organization estimates the number of COVID-19 cases in Africa could rise to 10 million in the next 3 to 6 months. The New York Times reports public hospitals in 41 countries across Africa have less than 2,000 ventilators. 10 African countries do not have a single ventilator. For more, we're going to London, where we're joined by Kumi Naidoo, the former Secretary General of Amnesty International, former head of Greenpeace. He's a lifelong South African human rights activist and climate justice activist, was the first African to head Greenpeace. Kumi, welcome back to Democracy Now! As you hear those figures about Africa, and particularly what's happening in your country of South Africa, where decades ago you were very well-known anti-apartheid activists as you started your activism right through to today. Talk about what Africa faces.
I think this is an extremely terrifying and frightening moment for the people of Africa. It's important to note that that report that was released by the World Food Programme was already saying to the world that in 2020, we were already facing a major food crisis. That was before the coronavirus hit. Now we're looking at a situation where the report says that we could be looking at about 300,000 deaths per day over a 3-month period. Now, the reality for Africa is that before even the coronavirus hits, this is what we are dealing with. We're dealing with healthcare systems that are not strong. We're dealing with a population that has high levels of vulnerability because of the high levels of HIV, AIDS, and tuberculosis, and malaria. And we're looking at economies that are actually really struggling. So right now, I think we are in a very vulnerable state as the African continent, and we hope that international solidarity will be there to help our people get through this very bumpy ride ahead of us.
And Kumi, I'm wondering if you could talk about the impact, especially on the most populous nations in Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and of course South Africa, where you are. The question of the increasing globalization and urbanization of the world has led to these giant mega cities, even in Africa, where a virus like the coronavirus can spread much more rapidly. Amy mentioned South Sudan, a country of 11 million people. It's got more vice presidents, 5 vice presidents, than it has ventilators. It only has 4 ventilators in the whole country. How can these, especially large countries with these huge urban populations, cope? And what lessons do they have, for instance, in Uganda, which Uganda has a massive public health program that's already spreading out, trying to identify potential hotspots in their country?
Well, I think that the positive news is that the extent of how fast the virus has moved through the African continent has not been as devastating as it was in Europe. So when we look at the situation in South Africa, for example, the interventions that have been made by the South African government have really been to actually ensure, in the first instance, that we prevent deaths, but to actually buy time for when the pandemic peaks, so that during this time we ramp up on PPE, we ramp up on testing, field hospitals, and so on. So that's what's being planned. Right now, as we stand, the level of loss of human life in the African continent compared to Europe or the US, for example, is still painful, but you know, like South Africa, for example, the number is still under 100 deaths. So the preparedness, though, the preparedness of African countries, if we have a situation like what we had in New York, in terms of ventilators, equipment, trained personnel, and so on, is going to be pretty devastating. So that's why I think, the efforts now that are being made by individual African countries, but also by the African Union, needs to be generously supported. Because for many people in Africa right now, the choice is almost also between, if you want a pandemic that's a health pandemic or a hunger pandemic. And as many people are saying, if we don't get killed by COVID-19, we'll get killed by hunger. And so balancing this is going to be a very tricky act of leadership. But what we hope is that we have a mentality in terms of how we think we need to build the continent forward, is not to build back exactly what we had, which shows all these vulnerabilities. We have to learn from this so that we are building in a way that we address the climate crisis, we address inequality, we address maldistribution of budgetary resources, and so on. And
Kumi Naidoo, the price of oil dropping below zero for the first time ever Monday. The historic collapse due to this historic lack of demand as many in the world are told to shelter at home. What are the implications of this? And we just have a minute or two.
Well, the one sort of short-term positive, if you want, impact is that emissions have actually reduced drastically. And the fact that the scale of the impact has been so much, and the fact that people have responded in most countries with such urgency, and also, ensuring that they're taking the painful actions of being in lockdown. By the way, I'm not in South Africa. I'm locked down in London at the moment, waiting to try and get to South Africa. So given the fact that people have taken all of these efforts, shows that there is a greater capability within the people of our planet to take the big actions that we need to take to address the other challenges that have been with us for so long. The major problem right now, we have to be conscious that, as we saw with the United States after 9/11 and the Patriot Act, that was a special reduction in civil liberties and so on. But we see that even though 9/11 is behind us, many of those elements still remain. One of the concerns we must have is that we want to be very clear that as citizens, we are supporting what our governments are doing in this moment of crisis, but we also need to ensure that we do not have a situation where immediately after this, most of those measures remain in place. So we have to understand the crisis that we're in is a multifaceted crisis. It's a crisis of poverty, hunger, human rights, and of course, climate and environment. And let's be clear that if we don't address environmental degradation, the situation that we have now with the spread of viruses, as health professionals have been warning us, will continue. Forests and other ecological assets help prevent the flow of viruses and so on. And right now, humanity must take a hard look at ourselves about whether we want to build back after Corona exactly what we had, or we want to build back a more equitable, more just and a more sustainable world.
Kumi Naidoo, we want to thank you for being with us, former Secretary General of Amnesty International, previously the head of Greenpeace, lifelong South African human rights and climate justice activist. On this 50th anniversary of Earth Day special in the midst of the pandemic, well, just before our broadcast, 17-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg spoke in an Earth Day live stream hosted by the Nobel Prize Museum. She spoke about how Fridays for Future school strikes movement is responding to the pandemic.
Some people feel like, how long is this going to go on? And there's this kind of big uncertainty, and people are not always comfortable with that kind of uncertainty, and people want to know what will happen and how are we going to move forward. And it might be hard for many to accept that we don't know anything what's going to happen. We don't know how long this is going to go on, because we can't predict that kinds of things. It feels like right now the world is totally different from how it was just a week ago. So we just have to adapt and see what happens. And change our behavior and plan from there. And because that is what you have to do in a crisis. You have to adapt to the current situation. But still, I feel like within the Fridays for Future movement, there's still this sort of big sense of resistance, and people are thinking we will get out of this, and when we do, we will continue, and we will do everything we can that is possible in that situation to continue to push even harder. And I feel like many people have not lost their sense of hope. We have just changed the way we do things, and we're maybe just saving it for later at the moment.
That was 17-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg speaking in an Earth Day live stream hosted by the Nobel Prize Museum just before our broadcast. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we end today's show in Chile, where nearly 150 people have died from the coronavirus, with almost 11,000 confirmed cases. Mere months ago, the streets of Santiago and other Chilean cities were alive with a vibrant mass protest movement that drew hundreds of thousands and even led the UN Climate Summit to be relocated to Madrid, Spain last December. Now the public spaces of Santiago are largely empty as citizens shelter in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19. But the protest movement against austerity and the right-wing president, Sebastián Piñera, lives on as activists find new ways to organize online. For more, we're going to Santiago, Chile, to speak with Ángela Valenzuela. She's been active both in Chile's uprising and in the global youth climate strikes, which have also moved online. She's a climate activist, 350.org organizer, former coordinator with Fridays for Future Chile, and also a singer and songwriter. Ángela, we first spoke with you in Madrid at the UN Climate Summit. Welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you talk about the climate movement on this 50th anniversary of Earth Day in the midst of the pandemic in Chile?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here. Yeah, so, well, we are adapting to this new scenario using online tools and online organizing that we were already working on, but now really moving into this world of creating awareness with a spark of hope and using a lot of arts to convey our message so people can feel empowered still facing the COVID crisis and the climate crisis. And I think it's a very interesting moment where we can learn from what it means to confront a crisis like a crisis. Like, we are working with this campaign of fighting a crisis like a crisis. And I think the rapid response from many governments of like locking down and shutting down entire countries really shows what type of leadership needs to be done in terms of the climate crisis.
And Ángela Valenzuela, I wanted to ask you, even before Sebastián Piñera came to power, way back to the period of Pinochet, Chile became an example of privatization of neoliberal policies in Latin America, of the pension systems, of health and others. How has that affected this history of privatization? How has that affected the ability of the country to deal with the coronavirus now?
Well, what is really showing and demonstrating is that this system of extreme neoliberal policies and economic system, it's failing to protect people when a crisis like COVID-19 shows up unexpected, without any expectation. It's as serious as people don't have access to water to wash their hands. Like 1.5 million people in Chile don't have proper access to water. Then the healthcare system already collapses every winter without COVID-19. So we are very soon going to collapse the whole system of healthcare. People won't be able to have access to even ventilators. Like, we are 18 million people, for example, and we only have 1,500 ventilators, and already most of them are used. We only have 500 available.
Can you talk, Angela, about how climate protesters, I mean, you have this massive protest against inequality. So the president cancels the COP and it ends up in Madrid. Can you talk about how climate protesters are adapting in this time of COVID-19?
Well, everything is happening online. And not only climate protesters, but protesters in general, all strikers and the Chilean movement is saying that, you know, another way to fight is to stay home and to take care of each other, strengthen our networks through online organizing, and to have memory of what has happened in Chile in terms of the environment and as well with the human rights violations. We will not forget the people who have been murdered. We won't forget how we have sacrifice zones and how, like, even pollution in our cities are also making us more vulnerable to the COVID crisis. So once we go back to the streets and this crisis, this health crisis basically stops, or we go out again, we will go stronger. And I think this is a very important moment to reflect on this system that is not working and also to push forward for the change that is needed.
And Angela, I'm wondering if you could comment on, there had been this proposal by the Chilean government to possibly issue immunity cards to those Chilean citizens who have already recovered from the virus. What could be the possible effects of that, especially since it's not really even proven conclusively yet that immunity is established once you have recovered from the virus?
Well, it's a very irresponsible measure. As you said, it's not proven that you can get immune after you recover from the virus. Indeed, in South Korea, more than 140 people that were recovered already got the COVID-19 again as a second time. So I think it's just irresponsible. And also it shows this attitude that the government has of overconfidence. For example, we have more than 10,000 cases already. And the plans that were announced last Sunday is that slowly we will go back to a new normality, which means that public workers this week had to go back to work, which means that since May, classes, like students will have to go back to classes slowly, which will put their lives at risk, basically. So this sense, like, it feels like the decision-making actually, the decision-making is not putting people's well-being at the center, but basically trying not to commit the well-being of the economy. And this is really problematic.
Angela, President Piñera recently sparked outrage for posing in the main plaza in Santiago, where for months was the center of the raging anti-inequality protests that were taking place. The plaza has remained empty since the coronavirus has forced the country to shut down. Your response, the symbolism of what he was doing, and your final comment.
Well, that action of taking that picture with this heroic posture, it was really outrageous, first of all, and also violent, because as you said, this square it used to be called Plaza Italia, but during the uprising, we renamed this space as Plaza Dignidad, which is Dignity Square. And it's been a very symbolic point. People have died there fighting because of police brutality, and people have lost their sight because of being shot at directly at their eyes with rubber bullets. So when you see him, when he takes advantage of people being in quarantine and not allowed to go out, and he goes there.
We have 5 seconds.
Okay, it's just showing his lack of empathy to this whole social process that we are living.
Angela Valenzuela, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Climate activist, 350.org organizer, former coordinator with Fridays for Future Chile. As we wrap up our 50th anniversary of Earth Day special in the midst of this raging pandemic. Democracy Now! Is working with as few people as possible, the majority of our team working from home. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Be safe.